the Franks. Now, we've mentioned this in the past. We've covered it when we discussed the superstitions that emerged in the Latin church over time, but we haven't really delved into this issue of the Merovingians, the Franks, Charlemagne, Frankish thesis, this kind of stuff. So there's new stuff that has come to light that I've seen that Snek has uncovered as well. So in the Old Testament, you have the promise of the Davidic king all the way back in Genesis. And so from my vantage point, this is kind of debated a lot in different theological traditions and circles, whether the Bible is monarchical or whether it's some other form of government, republicanism or something like that, which people actually try to argue. But I think it's pretty clear that the Old Testament promises are of a monarchy. There's stipulations in the law of Moses about how the king should operate. And in fact, when we look at Solomon, he failed to abide by the stipulations that the Mosaic law had upon the king. So none of that in itself, though, suggests that somehow monarchy or the king is inherently evil or bad or whatever. It's a common misunderstanding. And in fact, there's many places in Scripture, Proverbs, the book of Judges, where the people are castigated for not having and following a righteous king. When there is, of course, the statement that everybody goes to where, Samuel says, well, you want a king to be like the nations around you. So Israel was clamoring for this kind of pagan warrior king. And that's what the rebuke is about. It's not about a form of government itself. So all the way up into the New Testament, we find this consistent principle, as you said, of symphonia. Paul outlines this clearly in Romans 13, where he says that even the emperor is a diakonos of God, so he has a ministerial role. And the confusion here arises a little bit in the early church, where some of the post-apostolic fathers and writers are a little unclear. Part of that is because some people thought there was going to be an imminent return, right? So if you're in this period of persecution for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, where it was heavily persecuted, there was a lot of writing that thought, well, Christ is going to, this is a wicked world. Christ is going to save us. There's no point in thinking about the relationship between church and state. That's one mindset or position that was being debated in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. Some of the groups like the Montanists, for example, Tertullian, they ended up taking a very anti-state approach. They thought, oh, this is all the devil's domain or whatever. However, it's not all one-sided. There was a lot of debate. There was questions and things that arose, like you can find in the letters of Clement, for example. He talks about the legitimacy of the death penalty. He says we don't reject the idea of the state itself. We don't reject these things only when they overstep their bounds and try to trample on the law of God. So there's both of these ideas kind of present in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. Well, what eventually wins out, obviously, is that when Constantine, and it's not really with Constantine, it's actually with Theodosius that we begin to see the beginning of Christian laws. So the church kind of explicates this in more precise way by the time that Byzantium comes to preeminence, when you get these Byzantine rulers. That's not to say that there weren't heretical rulers. Obviously there were, but to make this short and sweet, by the time we get to the 6th and specifically the 7th Ecumenical Council, there's a lot of the terminology, a lot of the phraseology that's used in the acts and letters of those councils that speak of the emperor, or even the empress perhaps, or both of them, as the God-ordained emperors. So at Nicaea II, you get a really clear explication in the Acts of the Council and in the opening of the Council, the letter to the emperor, of the idea that the Orthodox Imperium is what God has providentially sort of ordained, right? And so that's why we'll get this problematic situation when we have the ordination of a separate Imperium for the West.
Yeah, exactly. May I just add that there's one position that you do not find in the early church, is the idea that the church and representative from the clergy rule above the state. Actually, part of the Bible that says no direct theocracy like this. In the
like the papacy, like the idea that Peter can, he's above everybody in the world, even every ruler.
Yeah, and that's what you see in the Franks too. So, for example, in 511, still under Clovis, it's the very end of his reign, there's a Council of Audience. And in this Council of Audience, they express some level of interaction between state and church. And they explain that since the church is not taxed, if someone wants to join the clergy, they need to have some level of approval from the king, except if they are sons of clergy, which also shows that in the West at the time, people were, clergy were having children in wedlock, which is also interesting. So you have this idea from the get-go of this interaction, intricate interaction between church and state without one really taking over the other. And it's also a great time to talk about how the Merovingians, so the Merovingians are the first French dynasty. The Merovingians, the sons of Clovis, understood their relations with Byzantium, with the empire, the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. And Clovis understood his role as Rex, as a king, not as an emperor. And he actually took the mantle of council, so he had the seal and the mantle of council. During archaeological finds, we even found that his father was buried with this imperial insignia. So he understood his role with the universal empire, which is unique. There's only one, as a king, and he was approved by the Byzantines because at the time he was the only Germanic king who didn't convert to the Arian faith. He converted to Orthodoxy. So there was this very interesting role, and Byzantium even had no problem with Clovis crushing some Western Roman pockets, like the Kingdom of Soissons, stuff like this. So you have this these two entities working together, with one acknowledging that the other is the empire, and one acknowledging that the other is a kingdom. So you still have the Merovingian respected this idea of, even though they wanted conquest, even though they took land, they still respected this idea of Romanity.
Yes,
they wanted to be Roman by respecting also the empire. And the real shift is a bit later on. With the Carolingians.
Icon fighters that caused the religious conflicts between the Franks and the empire. A few years after the Lateran Synod, the situation changed in Constantinople, and an iconophile empress, Irene, convened the Seventh Synod. As we know, the Synod fully restored the veneration of icons. And what was the Franks' reaction to this? Instead of hailing the return of heretical Greeks to the Orthodox faith, they composed a reply against the heretical Synod and rejected Nicaea too. This was the time when Charlemagne's military successes gave birth to the dreams of a domination of the world by the Frankish court. Indeed, the Franks now felt powerful enough to cast aside every pretense. They were not in the least interested in any Orthodox faith or even the condemnation of the iconoclasts in 769. This meant nothing more than a means of conquering Italy. They were not even interested in the Pope as long as he held a different opinion. When Pope Hadrian received the Capitulare, it must have shocked them. He would not have even expected this kind of a reaction, given that his representatives participated in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and his epistles have been recorded in the Synod's minutes. And even Patriarch Theresias himself had pointed out how exceptionally focused Hadrian was on the ancient traditions of the Universal Apostolic Church. He immediately issued a reply, I'm almost done, known as the Hadrianum, and sent it to Charlemagne. In it, he refuted point by point all of the Frankish mistakes, adhering to the orthodox decisions of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Charlemagne, however, had already made his mind up on these issues. Instead of accepting the Pope's clarifications and rejoicing, as the Orthodox normally do to this very day about the Seventh Ecumenical Council, with the Synodicon of Orthodoxy and the Sunday of Orthodoxy over the victory of the icons, which decision was signed by all the five patriarchates. Instead, Charlemagne instructed his theological advisors to compose a new theology, and this is how we get the renowned Libri Carolini, which came to be and expressed the Frankish theological positions opposed to the Orthodox ones, both the Orthodox view of Rome and the Orthodox view of Constantinople.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Something very interesting that, so you see that the Franks, they don't really care about theology. What they care about is not being the empire, and they don't care about the papacy. And what's very funny is that today people will defend this Frankish dogma,
especially the trads. Exactly.
Yeah, you are defending the people who subverted Rome way before Vatican II.
Yes, exactly. That's wow, the irony. Exactly.
Yeah, and we are defending what Rome used to be in all its glory, and this they were not genuine, and it's demonstrated best of all by Theodore Phorpholians, who in the Liber Carolinii fought against icons, who said we cannot have icons in churches. In his own church in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, you can see to this day, commissioned by him, there's even a note in Latin says that he commissioned it, a mosaic, a Byzantine mosaic inside the church of the angels and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to show it on screen. So he himself didn't care, to the point that he will write that it's a heresy, and he commissioned it. And this was destructive to the West, because the West used to have a very nice iconographic tradition. If you look at early churches, even Carolingian churches, it's very Byzantine. It's the same beautiful tradition of icons that you are trying to reappropriate today as a Roman Catholic. And it was destroyed by this, because since there was no real position on icons, there was no real position on how to regulate icons. There were no real position. What can we make an icon? What is canonical? What is and then you've got these very gory statues coming in. It's nothing like the original Romanesque art that you have.
Yeah, the Seventh Council was very interested in not letting pagan art come into the church, and that's why they're developed a very precise way of doing the iconography. Which is not to say that there's not some area of divergence. Obviously, certain churches have a little more of a three-dimensional representation in their iconography as opposed to others. The point is not to be pharisaical. The point was rather to set some guidelines and some hedges so that you don't let the really weird, crazy stuff creep in, like you get in the Renaissance with nude bodies and basically X-rated type stuff going on. I won't use all those terms for YouTube, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah, we've covered this in the past.
Exactly, it was destructive for tradition, and not only was it destructive directly, it was a time bomb. This Liber Carolinii was a time bomb. So today you have people arguing against the Protestant for being iconoclast. Why are they iconoclastic? Because during the Reformation, the reformers who studied tradition, namely Calvin, looked at the Liber Carolinii. Mm-hmm. And he says that he approved councils, but he says that he cannot approve the Seventh Council. So if the Protestants were destroying Roman Catholic churches during the Reformation, it is because of these kind of errors that were perpetrated through the Liber Carolinii. And by the way, Theodore Phorpholians is a Roman Catholic saint. Mm. So he planted the seeds.
The seeds of the Reformation are there, yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, that's wow.
Yeah, if you have very weird Mary statues today, very weird Pachamama stuff, it's because of this, because there was no limit set on the icons. And if you have Protestant iconoclast, it's because of this as well.